Most youth will not find work. That is the name of a report published by the IRR, which aims to lay out a clear analysis of the biggest problem in South Africa and offer 3 simple practical steps to begin to solve it. Today, Stats SA released its latest data for the first quarter of 2022. And while there were slight marginal gains that were expected, probably the most important result is that the rate of people between 15 and 35 that are not in employment, education, or training has continued to climb. Unemployment continues to be this country's biggest problem. So I'm going to offer a brief slideshow, walk you through some simple points, tell you some of the things that you probably already know, and get into some of the stuff that I think usually escapes public attention, to lay the case for why most youth will not work on the current scheme, and what needs to be done about that. So if you look at people between 15 and 34, you're looking at what should be the most dynamic and energetic group of South Africans. These are people that should be upskilling and entering the workforce. Unfortunately, 46.3% of this group is not in employment, education, or training. And that is up from last quarter when it was around 44%, and hugely up if you look at the trend over the last 15 years. Obviously, some people, the people in the 15 to 24 age group, are going to be at school or of schooling age. That's where they should be. Some are already dropping out. The rate is a little bit lower here. Only 37% are not in employment, education, or training, because more people are still in school at this younger age. So a really key group to look at, and Stats SA doesn't publish this explicitly, but you can calculate the data by looking at what they do publish. The key group to look at is the 24 to 34 group. These are people that have left school, left university, left technicons, left technical training. What are their prospects? Well, as of the first quarter, 55.3% not in employment, education, or training. That's 5.8, nearly 6 million people in the bloom of life, facing the very dire prospect of not being able to work. Now, especially as a young man who was unemployed for a time, I can personally attest to how dangerous this is and how important it is to rectify that as a matter of utmost urgency. So the Institute of Race Relations asks, what do other people think? My opinion is I think unemployment is the biggest issue. I think it's very worrying. But what do other people think is the biggest problem in this country? Thousands were asked, randomly sampled, demographically representative groups, an independent company hired to do this survey. An open question: what do you think is the biggest problem in the country? And once again, unemployment came in top. Now, people were asked to say what are the biggest 2 problems, which is why these numbers add up to more than 100%. Unemployment was given top by a majority: crime, security, corruption, and further down the line, we see corrupt leadership, inequality, racism, and discrimination. So the point here is that unemployment is #1 issue, and it's been like that in every survey since the IRR started commissioning these projects back in the early 2000s. It's a problem. Most people know it's a problem. It hasn't always been getting worse, and this is a fact that a lot of people overlook right now. If you want to blame it all on the deep past, you're going to ignore a great success. On the expanded definition of unemployment, we came down from 8 million in 2003 to 6 million in 2002. The expanded definition of unemployment, that just means the definition that includes people who've just given up looking for work, was 8 million, came down to 6 million. And that's in a period when the population was continuing to grow. But more importantly, it was in a period where GDP was growing at around almost 5% on average in this 6-year period. Unemployment was coming down in a serious way. It was not jobless growth. It was real growth. That's what growth does. Then the trend reversed. Expanded definition unemployment increased dramatically, and so too did the official definition. A little bit of a spike here around the pandemic where you have an inversion. This is people giving up work. So the official definition goes down, but the expanded definition goes up. Duration of unemployment is very important to look at for people who think that it might just be frictional. Frictional unemployment is the name for a kind of unemployment that's not too bad. That's just when people are hopping from one job to another. Is that what's happening in South Africa? Most people are workless, but that's just for a little while. When they get a little hungry, then they find some work again. Absolutely not. Back in 2008, 60% of people who were unemployed had been unemployed for more than a year. That is already one of the highest rates in the world. 40% less than a year. That's still not frictional unemployment, which is supposed to be a few weeks to a couple of months. But that was the ratio. It is now substantially increased. We now have 60% go to 80% unemployed for over a year. Unemployment has become deep, structural, and entrenched. Some people say this is just because of COVID, and here's a brief graph to show that that's not correct. You saw that on the official definition of unemployment, unemployment actually came down in South Africa, unlike India, Argentina, Egypt, all these other countries that are similar in their GDP per capita or in other senses, peers. Their unemployment did increase dramatically, most dramatically in India, from about 7.5% all the way to 15%. Unemployment doubled. But then it came back down before the end of 2020. Same in Egypt. You have a slightly more elongated story in Indonesia, but it comes back down there too. South Africa, it continues to climb. And although today we had a little bit of good news about some of the unemployment numbers coming down, those numbers are not coming down for the youth NEET rate. That's those who are not in employment, education, or training. So what are the big three problems? If it's not COVID, if it's not frictional, if it's not just temporary, not just cyclical, if it's getting stuck and it's getting deeper, and it's not just history, we've actually had employment improve in the 2000s and then flatline after that and then suddenly decrease terribly without any recovery. What is going on? Well, we say there are three basic explanations, and the first one is education. Very simply, South Africa has a terrible public school system. If you look at 1 million learners who enrolled in grade 1 in 2009, by 2021, only about 43,500 got a genuine matric pass with mathematics good enough to go and get some technical training in a quantitative field. That means only 4% of grade 1 learners got that kind of pass 12 years later. That's a shocking pass rate. And it's a sign of just a completely failing public school system, described by The Economist magazine once as the world's worst on a bang for buck basis, because it's not that we don't spend a lot of money on it as taxpayers. It's just that we have terrible absentee rates by teachers and other fundamental problems that are harming our youth. Why does this matter in terms of unemployment? Because most unemployed people don't even have a matric. The next biggest group are those who do have a matric but no other skills. Only 2% of unemployed persons are university graduates, although university graduates are a substantially larger group of the general working age population. So yeah, doesn't mean you're guaranteed a job if you've got a degree, but it does mean you've got a better chance if you've got some kind of skills post-matric, and you can't get that if you don't get a decent matric. Okay, here's an important question that we've asked in terms of this skill set development. In the same survey that I referred to earlier in 2020, would tax-funded vouchers for education, healthcare, and housing help you personally to get ahead more effectively than current BEE policies? Now, this is grouping together all three: education, healthcare, and housing, and putting them against BEE. Earlier, we asked just about education. Huge enthusiasm for education vouchers. Those are vouchers that would allow parents to step away from the schools that governments are trying to force them into and take a check in the mail for the same cost that children are currently expended on at public schools. Parents would get that check and they would only be able to redeem it at an accredited school They couldn't go anywhere else. They'd have to go to educating their kids. But they'd be able to decide where. If the school that's close is not working, they can send them somewhere else. Huge enthusiasm for that in general, but what about putting that against BEE? Well, we find amongst Black respondents, almost 3/4 would rather have that kind of voucher system than BEE. In fact, if you look at the white respondents, they've got the highest percentage saying no, they'd rather stick to BEE. They'd personally get more preference out of BEE. More than a third saying that amongst white respondents, only 15% saying that amongst Black respondents. Now, sort of blending topics here, because the first topic is really just about a failing education system, but bear this in mind as we move forward through the other two major problems that we identify at the heart of South Africa's unemployment crisis. Number 2 is the minimum wage. Now, this is an important one. You see a bunch of facts here. Let me first just explain to you that the thing about the minimum wage is it sounds very nice when the government says we're going to make a law that people have to pay you more. Because who doesn't want to get paid more? And if the government can force that, wouldn't that be great? There is, however, a terrible problem, which is that sometimes an employer is going to say, instead of paying my staff more, I'm going to fire some of my staff. They can't fire their staff. It's expensive and it's difficult to retrench, expensive to retrench. But maybe then I just won't hire new staff. That harms unemployment too. The question is, what is the median wage compared to the minimum wage? The median wage in South Africa is 24 Rand per hour. The median wage, that means 50% of South Africans earn more than that, and 50% of South Africans that are working earn less than 24 Rand per hour. It's hard to get a job, not a lot of skills. So a lot of people are working for cheap. The amazing thing is the minimum wage has just been pushed up by Minister Thulas Nxesi to 23 Rand 20 an hour. It is almost equal to the median wage. That means almost 50% of South Africans are earning less than the minimum wage. Of course, government workers can be paid 12 Rand 75 per hour. So the argument can't be that there's no decent way to work for less than 23 Rand an hour. But the government has set that. And so technically, almost half of South Africans are at hazard of being illegally employed, so that their employers have to be punished, maybe to bankruptcy, so that they lose their job, or so that they simply get to lose their job because they're engaging in some illegal practice. It's like drug dealing to work for 20 Rand an hour in this country. It's absurd. Private exemptions have been erased. And I'm going to just lay this out there. If you look at international experience, there is no country on earth that has tried to enforce such a high minimum to median wage ratio. To give a sense of context, the United States currently has a minimum to median wage ratio of 25%. That means whatever the median wage is, the minimum wage is 1/4 of that. Here, the median wage in South Africa is 24 Rand. A quarter of 24, if I remember this correctly, is what is that? 6 Rand, 7 Rand, 6 Rand. That's what they would set the minimum wage at in South Africa. That's even less than the government minimum. And they're trying to push it to the kind of government minimum that we have. They're trying to push it to 50% of the minimum wage. So in South African terms, that would be 12 Rand. Roughly 12 Rand an hour is where they're trying to put the new minimum wage, and relative to the median wage. And their equivalent of Stats SA estimates that over 1 million jobs are going to be lost as a result of that. So really, the question is, how many jobs are you prepared to lose in order to bring up those people who will keep their jobs and get a raise? And that question already becomes very difficult when you're going for a 50% ratio. But we have, as you can see, a 100% ratio, or 96% ratio technically. So let's look at that compared to other countries. Estonia, if you measure up what our minimum wage is per month, this is actually using data from the first quarter of 2020. If you used it right now, our minimum wage would be just over 4,000 Rand. It would be even worse, but there it is. Estonia, on their ratio, would be sitting at around a minimum wage of 1,200 Rand per month. Vietnam would be a 1,300 Rand per month minimum wage. Spain would be less than 2,000 Rand. Mali would be less than 2,000 Rand. The United Kingdom would be less than 2,000 Rand. Croatia, South Korea, France. France is the highest minimum wage just about that's actually enforced in the world. It's about 50% of the median wage, 55%, pushing on 60% of the median wage, which here would come to over 2,000 Rand, probably about 2,500 Rand by now. Brazil is even closer, but we are way up here. And so you get a sense of how when you put it that much higher, it's so many more people that are going to get stuck in the position where their employers don't want to hire new people or they actually want to let their staff go. It's even worse if you multiply the minimum to median ratio by the unemployment rate. All of those other countries have very, very low unemployment rates. South Africa is just a standout feature over here. So I think it's clear what the problem is, amongst other things. If you go back a few steps to look at our unemployment dip over here towards the end of 2020, 2021, sorry, from the pandemic period, from the winter of 2020 into 2021, as the expanded definition of unemployment gets much worse, GDP contracts, the COVID strikes, lockdown strikes, irrational regulation strike. And so employers let go of a lot of labor. And then whereas in other countries, they're then very keen to rehire those staff and get going again and rehire them as cheaply as they can. People are desperate to go and work. They'll work for very little and they'll get the ball rolling again. In South Africa, employers don't want to do that. They can't afford to do that because you've got this new, awesome, world record high minimum wage. It's really devastating way to keep people down, to kick those that are really down in the teeth. Okay, the third factor has got to be about race. This is South Africa after all. And there is this widespread idea that if there is high levels of unemployment, it is because white monopoly capital is refusing to share the wealth. Now, unfortunately, Stats SA has not been able to do an inequality trends report with data later than 2015. Just quite recently, the Stats SA put out a statement to say that they finally have gotten the funding to do a report like that again. They were looking at doing one more recently, and then it was cancelled at the last minute. Very suspicious given the trends that were being seen. But in any case, this is some of the most important data you can see about race in South Africa. And what it shows is that by 2015, white people were earning 1/3 of income, which is greater than their proportion of the population, but much smaller than the proportion of earnings that they were taking home in 1994. At that stage, white people were earning about 2/3 of income, and black people in the broader sense, the BEE sense, were earning 1/3, and that ratio has inverted. But it's even more interesting if you look, South Africa being a highly unequal country, at the top 10%. Here you can see the largest earning share in the country goes to the black top 10%, at over a quarter of earnings, of all earnings going to that group, whereas the white top 10% is only getting about 10% of all earnings. So just in terms of buying power, which matches this income power on separate data on Stats SA, you see that the white monopoly capital myth, the idea that a few people with a lot of money are deliberately acting in strange ways to punish most black people, there's completely insufficient clout to pull off that kind of trick. Here you see the black middle class growing, needs to be growing more, whereas the white middle class is earning almost twice as much as the white elite. The black middle class is earning less than the black elite. But what you can't see here are these tiny little numbers, these invisible slices. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that is where the biggest country in this problem lies. The fact that you cannot see the unemployed too often, too easily. But here, one can see it. The black bottom 40% on Stats SA's definition of earners was taking home 3.4% of national income in 2006 and 3.7% in 2015. Almost no change. And by far the lowest income per capita in the group by any breakdown. Whereas the black top 10% grew quite nicely. Black middle, 50%, enjoyed some growth. The black bottom 40%, staying unemployed, gained very little more. Very, very little besides a few grants to go around. And this is the problem. And it's not just a problem for black people. There are unemployed white people. There are unemployed colored people. There are unemployed Indian people. But in terms of the ideology of our ruling parties of government, it's very important to note on race that insofar as the mission of the Department of Employment and Labor under Minister Thulas Nxesi is particularly to improve this group, and insofar as this has been the ANC's agenda to help poor black people, you can see a total failure in black and white. Right now, probably the worst thing on the horizon in terms of race law, in terms of jobs, is the EEB. The IRR has predicted that this is all but sure to guarantee joblessness going above 50% on the expanded definition. What the EEB does, which has just been passed by the National Council of Provinces very recently and now sits on the president's desk, what it'll do if he passes it is reintroduce racial pre-qualification criteria permanently. The Constitutional Court has actually just allowed them to be extended for another year. And that basically means that government spends R1 trillion and it doesn't have to spend that on the cheapest goods. It'll instead spend that on some goods that are owned by people in some of these upper echelons, rather than by value for money schema where you can see the best price. You have pre-qualification criteria. Likewise, private sector hard quotas, and we've seen what kind of effect that has in the public sector and what that's done to service delivery. Now, let's look at a few ways to think about how race laws like the EEB on the horizon and like BEE that we've been living under for a long time, how they hurt the majority of black people, those poor black people I was looking at in the data. You've got Muoletsi and Becky, stellar analyst in my view. Nice quote from him. The minute you have a system where people make money just by the connections they have rather than the work they do, the system is ripe for abuse. It's a recipe for corruption. Is he wrong? Zwelinzima Vavi was reported in the Sowetan as saying today, BEE was never going to help save South Africa achieve economic transformation. And then a direct quote was given, it made very few people rich while the rest of South Africa languish in poverty. Well, I've just shown you the data to show that Zwelinzima Vavi is exactly right. Peter Bruce, writing yesterday or the day before, says, when Ramaphosa and other leaders complain about a lack of transformation, they're simply reflecting the fact that they've failed to grow the economy fast enough. And that matters because if you want jobs to grow, if you really want transformation, if you want to take the poorest people, the people that are suffering the hardest in South Africa, most of whom are black, but not all of whom are black, if you want them to have a better life, you need to grow the economy. That's not happening. The state capture report looks at another way that race laws hurt the majority of poor black people. 4 points. These are all direct quotes straight out of the state capture report. First asks, what's the Constitution about? Is it when it comes to procurement, when government's spending R1 trillion every year, just about almost, is that to buy things for the cheapest, or is that to try and pay things to people who've already got a lot of money so that they get a little bit more? And it says there's an inevitable tension when you don't say which one comes first, when you just leave it. You say, we can talk about it, but let's not say one has to come ahead of the other. Let's leave it vague. That creates a very, very bad problem. The failure to identify the primary intention is unhelpful and it has negative repercussions. This is such an understated way to say that, as the former procurement general of the Treasury said, half the time people deliberately abuse this confusion to inflate contracts that can go from 6 million to 200 million overnight. Here's a direct quote from the State Capture Report. These are all direct quotes. Ultimately, in the view of the Commission, the primary national interest is best served when the government derives the maximum value for money in the procurement process. Procurement officials should be so advised. The primary national interest is best served when the government derives the maximum value for money. So weighing up these two things, transformation, as it's called, really, making rich black people richer, or getting value for money, which is good for all South Africans, rich and poor, black and white. Clearly, the primary national interest is best served when the government derives the maximum value for money in the procurement process, and procurement officials should be so advised. So how do we fix the problem? How do we fix the problem that currently most youth don't have a job, aren't even getting trained or getting skills, and that the next generation is facing the same horrific prospect? How do we deal with the fact that the unemployment line in South Africa is could run under social distancing from Cape Town to Cairo, and then all the way across the ocean, and then all the way up through Europe to St. Petersburg? We say there are three simple options. 3 simple steps, I beg your pardon. None of them are options. You have to do them all. First, you have to do the education vouchers. It's much more popular than BEE. It's a great solution. It works in Africa. It works across the world. International experience shows. That is the long-term investment to improve skills to get South Africa in terms of the labor force in a better position. Secondly, for right now, you've got to cut the national minimum wage. If the government can hire people for 12 Rand an hour, anyone should be able to work for 12 Rand an hour for something other than the government, for a business other than the government. It would be unanimously embraced by left-wing and right-wing economists alike in America, in Europe, in the Far East. Their top empirical analysts all agree that you need a minimum to median wage ratio, much, much lower than ours currently is. And the third thing you need to do is scrap all the race laws. Let people compete on merit. As you can see from the data, there are a huge variety of South Africans in the upper class, in the middle class, and in the lower class when it comes to race. And the biggest problem is not how people look in those 3 strata, but rather how people suffer in the unemployment line. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of our presentation. And I want to thank you very much for your attention. I encourage you to share this if you found any of it interesting. It is a summary of the report and a rehearsal of the briefing that we gave to some journalists in the hopes that we can try and explain why it is that we sometimes sound so harsh. It is not the case that I want to cut the minimum wage because I want people to struggle to make ends meet. It's not the case that I want to scrap race laws because I have any agenda about one race doing better than another. And it's certainly not the case that I want parents to have the right to choose where they can send their children rather than them being stuck in bad government schools because I have any negative attitudes to those parents. Rather, it's the case that sometimes the solution at first glance that looks nice backfires. And the solution that looks a little bit tougher, on reflection, on second thought, turns out to be the one that offers more people more opportunities to live a better life. And that really is our primary interest.